Stay hungry, stay foolish.
To be successful, innovation must overcome constraints in 6 areas: individual constraints, group constraints, organizational constraints, industry, societal, and technological constraints. Today's guest offers guidance on fostering creativity and overcoming the hurdles of each area of constraint. He's professor of business strategy and innovation with Vanderbilt University and author of Creative People Must Be Stopped: 6 Ways We Kill Innovation Without Even Trying. Welcome to the show, David Owens.
Thank you so much, Aidan. Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on.
It's great to have you on the show. I've been looking forward to this chat for a long time. You have a brilliant TED Talk. What I loved about the book was I thought of people like I did work in industry, and you have no framework to approach innovation. And oftentimes we get innovation and creativity mixed up. It'd be great to get your views on that.
Guys, I've spent a long time trying to think about how do you be more creative? How do you be more innovative? And it took me a long time. It's probably about 10 or 15 years before I realized that was like, what do you call it, a fool's errand, or basically the wrong way to be approaching it, barking up the wrong tree. I could think of 100 cliches, but that all really basically mean that's probably not the way to do it. What I realized was that I think creativity is really overrated. Certainly, the American society, I would imagine, in most societies in the world, it's about being creative is like the most important thing. It's so important to be creative. And I think actually there's lots of ways we think about creativity that are not that useful. In that TED Talk you referred to, I did a little thing where I was sort of playing with some ideas about how things that we think are creative are actually not creative. And I'm happy to share a few if you're interested in that and hearing that.
Please do, man. Please do.
So one thing I was thinking about was the iPod. So I show a picture of the iPod. People say, "Oh my God, that's so creative! That's so creative." I go, "That is not creative at all." Because if you sort of go into it and look at it, the iPod was based on technology that Diamond Rio had done, the Diamond Rio 500 3 years before. And Steve Jobs didn't invent music, didn't invent digital music, didn't do any of those things. And so actually, it was just a lot of really simple things put together into a format that sort of worked, but it wasn't like any kind of like radical invention or anything like really astoundingly new. And so that was one that we think of it as really this creative thing. In fact, it's not creative. I'll talk about what it is innovative, but it's really not creative. Another one I saw actually an article around Cristo in the I think it was the New York Times this morning, and it was talking about Cristo wrapping islands. And I thought wrapping all sorts of things, and I ran across this one where he wrapped a number of islands off the coast of Florida. I thought, wow, is that really creative, wrapping some islands? Actually, I mean, he had been wrapping all kinds of things before that. So it's like the idea of wrapping the island, like the creative part is really not the hard part. I think the hard part is actually wrapping the islands. It's not thinking of wrapping the islands. Another one, just one last one people think is very creative is the Post-it note. And so the Post-it note is kind of interesting. It took a long time for it. It was about 11 or 12 years for it to actually make it into production. And you might argue, well, that's because it was so creative. And in fact, it's not really that creative. It's just, a small piece of paper, too small to write on, an ugly color with bad adhesive on the back. You say, well, how's that creative? I mean, that's really not that creative. But what those things are is they have a different property, which is that they're innovative. And they're also innovative inside of a set of very strict constraints. And that was the magic of it for me, is to turn it around and say, the problem with being innovative is not sort of thinking outside the box and forgetting everything but in fact, it's really understanding what understanding what's possible and what's not possible, and then working within that and sort of deciding where to push out what I call constraints and where you have to actually honor them and where you can actually violate the constraints or the prior understanding of how things are.
One of the things I thought was really interesting was we have this kind of mask we wear in society, and we believe we need to behave a certain way. And for innovation to prosper, we need to let go of that. And I thought one of the exercises you use is really interesting and I'd love if you'd share this with our audience, the bumper sticker exercise you used where it led to the name of the book, which is Creative People Must Be Stopped.
Yeah, that it is. In fact, I was driving around town. I live here in Nashville, Tennessee, and there's lots of musicians and creative types here. I saw a bumper sticker on a car because I had up to that point I'd been thinking about like what is the most important theory of innovation. If I could only think of one thing, if I were going to die tomorrow, what would I tell people about innovation? I was really struggling with this question. And then one day I see this car drive by with a bumper sticker that says, "Creative people must be stopped." I'm thinking, wait a minute, like that's it. So I started chasing the car, literally in my car. I'm trying to take a picture of it. I almost crashed into it because I was trying to take a picture with my camera because it was sort of this profound moment of insight about it. And it was kind of interesting. It sort of has sort of two layers to it. On the one layer is, when I ask people, is this true? That most of them say no right away. They say no. Creative people should not be stopped. We need creativity. We need change. We need innovation. We need a new kind of world. And then I ask them, hey, do you have any kids at home? And they're like, yeah. I say, well, do you still believe creative people must not be stopped? And then have them think about some of the stories of them and their children. I had a daughter. One episode of the daughter and the duct tape and the dog. It was like, okay, stop. Whatever. She was looking for the dog and had some duct tape in her hand. I'm like, nope, not happening. Whatever it is, I don't want to go there. And so that sort of was sort of on the one layer, is sort of like that people have ideas and sometimes they're just not good ideas, or at least from a certain perspective, they're not good ideas. But then the other layer was to say, if in fact creative people must be stopped, or at least if the world behaves that way, then as innovators, our job is to say, how are they going to stop me? And if they're going to stop me, if creative people must be stopped, and I'm one of those people, they're going to stop me. Like, what do I do? How do I take evasive action? How do I become, in my words, was strategic around getting past the stopping? How do I stop the stopping in a way that allows me to sort of to be innovative, but also do things that matter in the world? Because just having ideas doesn't change anything in the world. It's having ideas that are actionable and that get acted on. That's the way you change the world.
I love this, David, because you say innovation is not so much about product anymore or the creativity, but it's increasingly about changing values and values that meet society where society is today.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And I think that you can move society to another place, but it always starts with where society is. And I think, there's the sort of the what do you call the axiomatic, the term of basically what they say is, like, when you're an artist, like, you can't break the rules until you know the rules. Like, once you know the rules, then you can break the rules. And then jazz music and all sorts of places there, it's that way. I really think there's some truth in that, of understanding where things are now, because otherwise my breaking the rules is just absurd. It's like Dada. It doesn't make any sense. Whereas if I know what the rules are and I say, okay, if I could actually just go a little bit past this one rule here, I might get to a really interesting place. And so, like, who was the guy who wrote with only a lowercase? Was that James Joyce?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, someone like that, right? Yeah. And so you write with only lowercase. I mean, it's clear that he knows how to write with uppercase, but writing with only lowercase sort of brought in a whole different feel for it. But if he didn't know how to write, if he didn't know that there's a thing called uppercase and lowercase, and that he was actually willfully violating that, it would not have had the same effect on people. And so I think you really do have to know what I call the constraints. That is, what's going on in that situation? What are the kind of things that stop you from moving in one direction or another? And it's only by understanding those that you can actually get to new places. Because some constraints are real constraints. I mean, if you say we're going to invent this new thing, but we don't have any money, not having money is a real constraint. And so things that cost money are probably not going to work for that particular idea. And so I like to think about things in that way. So it's almost the inverse of being creative, is like thinking way out there, way out in the blue sky, or out pie in the sky. But I think it sort of starts from a place of understanding, okay, where are we right now? What's happening with us? What's stopping this innovation from happening right now?
One of the things I loved about the book was, for many businesses and business leaders, they hire in a head of innovation, or they decide, we need to innovate more, and they hire somebody. And oftentimes they don't know why they're hiring them. They don't know what that person's going to do. And then on the flip side, that person doesn't know what they're going to do. And what I love about your work is you work both in education, but also you consult in industry, and you've consulted NASA and Nissan, etc. But the 6 points, I'd love to touch on these and go through them, if you would. 6 points of constraints, starting with individual constraints.
Yeah. So the place I really started with this was, it was sort of the joke was basically the worst place for innovation is the airport. And people are like, why is that? And I said, well, because the airport bookstore, you pull a book off you go in the airport bookstore and there's always like books on innovation, this, innovation, that. At least there were for a long time there. And the problem was, depending on whichever book you pulled off the shelf, it gave you one prescription for innovation. Like, oh, here's one, hire a bunch of Leonardo da Vinci's. And if you pull the book off right next to it, it says, oh no, like, don't worry about being disrupted. You might get disrupted. And the question for me was when does the one book apply and when does the other book apply? And I really couldn't figure it out. It took me a long time, a lot of reading, a lot of sort of really rethinking about how, first of all, how we think about innovation and how people write about it, but also how the academic world is one sort of chops up the world. And so when people write books, they write it from a perspective. And so let me just cut to the chase of what I'm talking about here. So I talk about these 6 constraints. First constraint, the most primary one being the individual constraint. So that's the constraints that we have as individuals. If you say innovation requires ideas, and you ask the question, where do ideas come from? Well, they come from people. And sometimes people have good ideas and sometimes people don't have good ideas. And so the question for me was like, what makes people have good ideas or not? The things I think about there are to have an idea, you have to have new information. So if you want to have an idea, a new idea, a creative idea, you need to base that on new kinds of information. To have that idea, you then also need to have different thinking styles, different ways of thinking, different problem-solving strategies. Sometimes it's right brain, sometimes it's left brain, sometimes it's analogic, sometimes it's linear, right? So there's different styles of thinking. And so let's say we get new information and we think of it in different ways. We then also have to express our ideas. Our ideas have to actually come out of our body in some way to have effect in the world. And that's to either convince other people or for people to help us make it better or for us to test our ideas. And so I was thinking if these 3 things are true, that is, I have to bring in new information, I have to think about it in different ways, and then I have to express my ideas that come from that, thinking new kinds of information in different ways, what can go wrong there? And so for me, what can go wrong is what I think of as a constraint is sometimes we don't bring in new information. I was thinking, like, why would we not bring in new information? Well, sometimes because, well, we're lazy. We don't want to bother to walk down the hall and ask, Joe, who actually happens to be a world expert on this thing, or we don't want to go to the library, or we don't want to go to data that's not in the form that we are used to. And so it takes a lot of work. So there are lots of reasons why we don't bring in new information. And so if I take in new information, if I don't take in new information, if I use the same old information I always get, the same industry reports, the same analyst reports, the same everything the same, I'm not going to get to a new place, or it's going to be much more difficult. In the second step, I could bring in new information, but if I don't think about it in different ways, that's a problem also, because it may be that I'm used to thinking about it a certain way. It's almost 5 o'clock. I got to go home. And if I do it this other way, I have to do a spreadsheet. That's going to take me an hour. I'm going to be late to pick up my kids. There are lots of reasons why we don't think of things in different ways. And then the last one about getting the idea out of our body, basically expressing our ideas, that sometimes we don't practice expressing our ideas, that our ideas are, we barely understand them ourselves. We're not sure if other people understand them. That already creates kind of a constraint, a kind of a barrier. Some people like to think in data. Some people like to think in visual. Some people like to think and if we're not able to express our ideas in ways that people understand, they're going to just blow us off. They're going to say like that's not meaningful to me because I can't understand it. And if you think about it, I mean, all this is really in some ways saying that if I don't if I can't express things in a way that you understand, and I'm asking you to change, or I'm asking you to accept some proposition for change, you would be very irrational to accept it. In other words, if I ask you to do something and you don't understand what I'm asking you to do, and you do it anyway, that would be really irrational. And often we think of innovation that somehow because we had an idea, that means people are obligated to accept it and to act on it, even without regarding whether they understand it or not. So that individual level thing for me was sort of like the world of psychologists. It was like when you think inside the brain, like what's going on for a person, how they have ideas. And that's really is where sort of innovation starts, was with a creative idea. But the kind of constraints, the kind of barriers I'm talking about and they're really simple things, like get new information, like, duh, of course, right? Think about it in different ways, like, yeah, no shit, right? Whatever. Express your ideas to people so they can understand them. I was like, yeah, of course, right? Yet we don't bother to do that because sometimes we're busy or we're afraid or there's lots of reasons why.
While it sounds simple, it's difficult to make it sound simple, but also like even take the physiological things that are going on. I loved what you said here. So our brain is stopping the floodgates of information for a reason, because if we had way too much information coming in, we'd grind to a halt because it's just way too information overload. And therefore it filters the information. And this is why we have habits. This is
Right.
why our basal ganglia takes over, all this kind of stuff.
Right.
And I love what you're saying. So you're saying open certain doors in your mind to allow new information in, and
Mhm.
or you'll eventually start thinking differently. And maybe across an organization, we have to do this as well.
Right, right. Especially, yeah, if you just substitute the idea of an organization for in the model I talk about it as, it goes on inside your head, but inside the person. Think about what goes on inside the organization. Where does the organization get new information from? What problem solving strategies is the organization really comfortable with? And how does the organization sort of create value, that is, express its ideas, right? So the organization has resources, it has things, and it creates new value from that. And that has to be apparent to people outside. If I'm going to give you my money to buy this new whatever, phone, car, anything, app, I need to understand that. I need to understand the kind of value that you're creating. And so, yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. And it's the case that we don't often think of those really, really basic things of, information and problem solving strategies and things when we go after having new ideas. The other thing that it brings up, and I've been thinking more about this lately, is we often think that innovation, it's like expensive, it requires time, it requires more resources. And I've been thinking about that in some ways that, for one, is this act of looking at data differently or going and finding new data is very inefficient. Like, I have to go find some new way when I could just go look at the industry association magazine. Why? It has the information. Like, why should I look somewhere else? It's like, no, you have to go find some new information. Then when you get that information, you don't understand it because it's different. It's not the way you normally work. And so that takes time to sort of understand it. And then when you're expressing those new ideas, the people around you, they're used to the old way we used to talk about this stuff and the old kind of data we used to get. So it takes them a lot of work to figure out what it is you're talking about and helping you assess, is this a better way or a less better way than the way we used to do it? And all that learning requires time and requires slack resources. That is, we have the capability of having people work on this or having time in people's days to work on this. So we hear of companies like 3M and other companies that have people work on unauthorized or unofficial projects. And it's to give them that time. And to the extent that an organization is so focused on production, on efficiency, on making things really smooth, you're going to select out that time. Any kind of steps in your process that add in extra steps like that, or what would be considered wasted time, are going to come out. And so we end up with what we have, which is people who are totally overscheduled, people who are totally overwhelmed with the information that they have. And so, to go back to your earlier point, bring in the poor schluck you hired as the innovation person and say, okay, now go for it, man. Here's all the people. Like, go make them innovate. And they're thinking, why would I do that? I have a day job. Because you're asking me to think about stuff that's probably not going to work, sort of almost by definition. And I get paid based on what I do that we do know how to do, that we do know how to measure. So why would I do that? That would make no sense. And so I think that it's a really hard task to step into an organization in one of those roles. And I talk to people all the time who are in those roles, and it is a very difficult place to be.
It's a dangerous job, actually, because firstly, and this is what again, going back to your book, you need to define what the organization thinks innovation is. And then,
yes, yeah.
Like you say, psychologically, you need to understand their constraints, their motivations, etc. And this is a lovely segue for the next constraint that you call out, which is group constraints. And then we need to unlock group constraints.
Yeah. So in the model, individuals work in groups, and the group constraints, that is the things that stop you from a group level, are really different than the individual level, at least the way I've defined them. And I think about things like emotion, things like culture, things like process, even the environment that you're in. And so it could be that I'm really good at bringing in new information, I'm processing it in my brain, and I'm actually expressing my ideas. And so let's say I have 5 of those new Leonardo da Vinci's in my organization, and I just have the boss walk in and say, that's a dumb idea. That'll never work. Last person said that, got fired. And then suddenly innovation's gone, right? And so having the idea or having the ability to generate ideas is not enough, because anything interesting, in fact, that happens in organizations involves other people. And so we have to get other people involved. We have to work with other people. And if I'm afraid to share ideas with you, that's a really hard place, because I can be as creative as I want. I can have the best ideas in the world, but if I can't get you to actually listen to me, or if I can't get you to make me to not make me feel like I'm going to lose my job if this experiment fails, then that becomes really problematic. And so there, I like to think about the feelings that you have when you're working with a group. And sometimes we use groups, I think, just to use them. I asked a group once that it's like, do you do mercy invitations in your organization? They said, what's that, mercy invitations? I have no idea what you're talking about. And I said, oh, where you invite someone to a meeting because you're afraid you're going to hurt their feelings if you don't. And they say, oh, yeah, we do that all the time. And so it's sort of interesting. And I say, well, if you invite someone because you're not hurting their feelings, are they always productive? I mean, are they productive in the meeting? And they say, well, no, sometimes people come in there and I don't want to invite them because they're a disaster in the meeting, because they criticize and they're showboating and they're, bringing in irrelevant stuff and they don't show up on time and whatever. And I say, well, why do you keep inviting them? They say, well, because, I'm having mercy on them. And sort of funny, because in organizations that we expect all this efficiency, and yet we tolerate all this inefficiency in the groups that we work in. Healthcare is not as good as it should be and could be, but they certainly don't do mercy invitations when they're operating on you. Right? Everyone who's in that room needs to be in that room for a reason.
Somebody's sitting in the corner eating popcorn, dropping it.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oops. Why are you doing that? Why? Yeah. So the group level is interesting to me. Also, the space. To use the healthcare example, I met a guy recently. He works at a large healthcare concern here in Nashville. They own lots of hospitals. And he's pushing to have their IT people, that is, their people who do lots of coding and stuff like that, they're basically writing computer code, to get them a special space where they can work. And he says, look, we do it for doctors operating. Why don't we do it for the coders? And the idea with the coders is they're supposed to be able to sit in some normal with air quotes, office kind of setting and do their work, by sitting at their desk and answer their phone when it rings and things like that. And that's actually not the most productive way to write code. He's using a thing called pair coding, where you put two coders together writing the same code. It turns out it's much more efficient if you just do the data, and they're big time data people. So they're doing the data of this. But then whenever a senior executive walks by and sees two people working on the same piece of code, they're like, what the hell? What's going on here? Like, that can't be efficient. But in fact, they catch each other's mistakes. They add different insights than the other person would bring otherwise. They motivate each other. When one person's slacking a little bit, the other one's like, come on, man, let's get this. We're almost done. Let's get this done. And so what he's chosen to do is to do that offsite. So he's got a space offsite where those coders are able to work in that way. And I've actually met a second organization that does the same exact thing. First of all, have them do pair coding, but then have them do it outside of the mothership, because they sort of don't understand the social nature of this innovation that they're creating, this piece of software code that people are writing. And so that sort of invokes partly the space also, like, the actual place that we're working together. If we can't share our ideas, if we don't have a whiteboard, or if we don't have easel pads, if we don't have markers, that really does slow down the process of us being able to communicate our ideas to each other and being able to help each other make our ideas better. And so that's the sort of this group level. I really spend a lot of time thinking about that. And most organizations, when they ask me for help, or when they ask me to either to help them think about what they're doing, there's often the group level. How you do groups is really so sort of, for me, it's like low-lying fruit. It's a place where you can do lots of different things that really change things, but that we often don't think of because we're so used to doing things a certain way. That is, they say it would hardly be a fish that discovered water, because water's everywhere. And so in that sense, the kind of the ways that we do offices of desks and one person working on their task and then giving it to another person to work on their part of the task, and lunch breaks and things like that we don't question those, but we don't ever really stop and say, is this helping us do this task that we're trying to do right now? Which in healthcare, which in flying jumbo jets, which in all sorts of other domains of human activity, especially team-based human activity, people think a lot about, what's the process? What do you do first? What do you do second? What do you do third? Who needs to be there? What's the space needs to be like? What are the tools that need to be at hand to do it? And if you think of creativity as just something that's genetic or something that happens, then you won't ever come to a place where you realize there's stuff you can do. There's really simple stuff you can do, like get round tables. I mean, it's pretty simple.
One of the things, David, that really jumped out at me was psychological safety.
Oh, yes.
So you talked about this efficiency. So somebody showing up to work and being brought to a meeting and doesn't need to be there, or say the culture of the organization is one where everybody's on tenterhooks and their cortisol levels are high always. Their brain's going to work differently. It's not going to have its full relaxed kind of creative state, and therefore,
yes,
one thing you're going to get less efficient employees anyway. Certainly, there's going to be no innovation because there's going to be no literally headspace for innovation to happen.
Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah, and there's sort of like the messing around with ideas, or the sort of the playing around with ideas, the things that kids do, right? That if you give a kid some stuff and they start playing around with it, like, how's this work? How's this work? How's this? And if that's not considered like business-like behavior, then we stop people from doing it. And I think you're really onto something there. That's really true, that we, through the lack of psychological safety, afraid to share their ideas. I saw a picture of what a ropes course is, where people do the trust fall.
Yeah.
So I saw a picture of a trust fall, and I was thinking, like, why are they doing that? I thought, well, they don't trust each other, right? So in the organization, you have a group of people that don't trust each other, so they have to do the trust fall. And I'm thinking that looks really dangerous. But then as I sort of started thinking back, I thought, well, why are they doing that? Well, they're doing it because they don't want to share their ideas in meetings. I thought, oh, you're afraid to share your ideas in meetings, but you're willing to risk a skull fracture with the same people. What? So it's sort of like really absurd at one level, but then at another level, it was also that, wow, it must be in some organizations, it's an act of courage to share an idea. I thought, wow, if you have to be a hero to have ideas in your organization, you're probably not going to be super innovative. I mean, if you have to be the one who, just basically you have to, jump off fall backwards off a truck into other people's hands in order to just say, look, people, I have this idea. I think it's going to be rough going in that kind of organization as far as innovation is concerned.
It's those people we talked about. I have been one where you're ahead of an innovation in a place that doesn't really want change. And therefore, you see this gradual decline in those people's energy and their desire to come to work. And like you said, you start then moving towards, your measurement is on small little incremental changes that are actually not innovation at all. And you start kind of drawing a line in the sand and going, oh, well, we brought in a new communication tool. We brought in Slack or Yammer.
Right.
Which is the furthest thing that you actually want to do in a role like that, but you're kind of forced to do it.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And be able to point at stuff like other innovative firms are doing this. I also like when you just first started talking that little piece there, you used it was an interesting phrase. You said you brought in to do innovation, but no one wants to change. And it's sort of interesting. Like, people want innovation, but they don't want to change. And I think that's it's kind of interesting, because I think there are reasons for not changing. I mean, there are very rational reasons. It's just when you're doing innovation, it's not rational to do it then. If you're trying to be efficient, if you're trying to get home at 5 p.m., if you're trying to just make your earnings this quarter and not worrying about the long term, absolutely, then it is don't change, right? Just keep things the same. But if they brought you in this because they say, look, we're going to die, we're going to die, this industry is going away, and then sort of keep you to these small changes that you're talking about, well, let's just put in Slack or Yammer, that's not going to move the organization anywhere. And so it's sort of that irony of everyone wants innovation, but no one wants to change, is a sort of a truism at that level. Yeah.
A nice segue again, because we talked about group constraints and so the next one is organizational constraints, and it's a different thing, because it is more about that. It's more about, well, if I'm going to innovate, I need to know what the strategy is so I can synchronize or I can segue with that strategy.
Right, absolutely, yeah. And so the sort of logic is that individuals work in groups, which were the first two layers. Then groups work in organizations, and the organization is like you said, is really different. I think, first of all, strategy. The fastest way to get an initiative or an idea killed, an innovative idea, innovation initiative killed in an organization, is to have it not be strategic. That is to say, this thing we're doing, how does it line with our strategy? And every bit of business school, of strategy, education, of economics, all that stuff says you want alignment. You want, those kind of, you want people moving in the same direction. You want people on the same page. And if you don't know the strategy, that's a problem. And sometimes people in organizations, they don't know the strategy. I mean, I'd love to help my organization move in the direction it's trying to move, but I don't know what the strategy is. You say, well, why not? Well, because it's a secret, or because we don't have one, or because we have one, I don't believe it, or because it changes every month, or because the new strategy that we're going to need is different than the old strategy we have, but people are afraid to think that new strategy. And so it's kind of interesting. I mean, it really puts you in this interesting place where it's hard to think about what is strategy and what is the strategy. And so I think for me, it's the strategy is first of all, we're moving to what we call sort of we have lower locus of control. That is, we have a lot of control over ourselves as individuals of having ideas. We have a little bit more control, a little bit less, but still can control at groups. But the organization level, it's often hard to change the organization, how the organization sees things. So strategy is a big one. The structure of the organization. There's all the sort of famous business stories of Kodak, of Xerox, are basically stories of how you generate ideas in one context and you evaluate those ideas in a different context. And so on the West Coast in the 70s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, all this crazy stuff was going on with Xerox, and all these companies were inventing this stuff. And then Xerox headquarters was in New York. And so these crazy guys from California came to New York, and they're like, dude, we got all this cool stuff. It's like the computer, and it's like, it's going to be cool. And the people in New York are like, well, can I use that on a copier? Like, that's our business, copiers. Say, well, no, man, but we got this thing called the folder and a mouse and like a WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. It's like, it's really cool. And they're saying, well, I can't use it on a copier. Like, get out of here. I don't want to talk about it, because we have a real business problem called protecting our industry. And so in that way, you could say, well, it's kind of a knucklehead thing in the New York people, but it really is a structural problem, because the people in California see a different world. I mean, they see all this stuff happening, and basically the Silicon Valley forming in front of their eyes. And then all New York sees is a bunch of foreign entrants coming into their copier market. You'd argue that Kodak has a similar problem. They have the sort of the not invented here problem. They invented the digital camera, but then didn't know what to do with it inside, because it didn't meet any of the ways that they measure how good something is. The image quality was horrible. Couldn't figure out how to print the pictures. There's no storage available, things like that. And so they just basically ignored it. And again, it might be a sort of a structural kind of problem there. And I think the to boil it down for me is the question of how resources are allocated across the organization. And so I find it kind of funny sometimes for me as a professor in this business school where I work. We're a good business school. I have control over exactly $300, not a penny more. If I have a penny more than that, I have to go to my dean and get literally a handwritten signature on a form. And so it's sort of funny, because I think of if I listen to some of the organizations I work with, I can destroy so much more value than that, so much more quickly. But somehow this thing that they can count, the dollars that they can count, they want to keep control over that. And that becomes like the measure of like, how are you using your resources? How did you use your $300? Like, did you use it really well or not? And for what I do, that is completely irrelevant to the kind of important stuff, right? Of for me, of getting in organizations, talking to people, understanding what the issues are, trying to help people articulate what they're feeling and seeing. Because all this stuff that I'm talking about is really just a re-articulation of what people have told me and what I've read and seen, just to try to put it in language and framework that people can actually do something with, and it's not just meant as an academic exercise, but really that we can do something with. So again, the structure of the organization, like where do you put R&D, where do you put headquarters? This is the innovation officer, sort of like what you said, and maybe what your situation was, is you come in and you're not sure, is this a centralized one or is this decentralized? Do I have my own group of people and I try to infect the organization with innovation? Or do I have a dual reporting structure? Do I, and those questions really matter. And they probably matter more depending on how the organization is already structured and what the organization strategy already is, than anything you're going to do coming in from outside.
It's funny you used the same term I used to use. Infect. You would find people who had similar energy, reverse vampires, who go around infect everybody and change them over time. But that one of the key things in an organization is it does take time, and we're about to go on to industry constraints. But before we do, you can change business models. But until you change mental models, nothing's going to happen.
Yes, right.
So it'd be great, David, to talk about industry constraints, because we're kind of, I feel like what you've done here is you've started in with a really high zoom lens, and then you're zooming out and out and out and out. So we're on industry constraints right now.
Right, that's right. So I am zooming out in that way. The industry constraints. So I say if individuals work in groups, and organizations operate in industries. And here, this is sort of the world of the economist, or even like the traditional business strategy kind of thinking. The kind of things I think there about competition, because we believe that competition leads to innovation. In fact, in the U.S., the antitrust. So I think right now we have Sprint and T-Mobile and Sprint want to join together, and the question of whether they're allowed to or not is whether that's going to decrease innovation. That is, giving better service at equal or lower cost to the consumer in the end. And that's basically the criteria that they use, or the acid test is are consumers better off by having them together than by having them apart? The last time T-Mobile tried to join, AT&T tried to buy T-Mobile. It was turned down, and after that, we got unlimited streaming. We got all kinds of crazy stuff that is just good for consumers from T-Mobile. In some ways, they had to do this. They had to start acting crazy in order to stay alive in that industry, and they were able to do that. And so, competition is one. Although we can also imagine that competition stops innovation, because if it gets too competitive, then people will leave the market. They'll say, well, I can't make any money doing that, so I'm going to leave that market. The other thing that I like to think about is suppliers, or we might call them professionals. So here in areas like education, healthcare, law, why is there so little innovation, or so little apparent innovation? I mean, there are things happening, there are things going on, but it's sort of not the kind of breakthroughs that we're seeing in technology or in communications or in other places. And I think it has to do with how we train people. So for me to become a professor, I have to get a PhD. To get a PhD, I have to get good grades all the way starting as a little kid. I sort of did, and I sort of snuck in the side door, but it's very unusual to come in that way, because it is it's just a way to do it. And also, imagine I have a sister. Was a physician, and she trained for so long. She must have trained. It must have been like 30 years of training before she gets to really truly practice. And then you think, okay, we're going to change everything. And she's like, no, we're not. I spent 30 years learning how to be competent now. Now you're not going to change everything and make me incompetent. So I have to learn it all again in that way.
That's a really key one, David. Sorry to jump in here, because
that was good.
The goalposts are constantly moving. So you said you snuck in the side door, but with that, you snuck in some new ways of thinking, and you brought in new kind of, mixes and synergies of thinking that wouldn't otherwise get into organizations. And I often find, and I said I loved your TED Talk because it was very human as well. And oftentimes we get so trained and so expert in a field that we remove all the humanity, or all the synergy, or all the, these fantastic mixtures of different disciplines. We take them out of the process. And it's usually through a cornucopia of lots of different thinking, or lots of different data, and lots of cross, disciplinary skills that magic happens. And that's what innovation really is.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. Yeah, I like how you're talking about that. It is, for me, it's interesting, because in some ways I felt like I came through the side door only because it was, after a certain point, you only fit to do certain things in society. And if you get too overeducated, you get fit for exactly nothing. I feel like I was always this way. They always sort of working between. So I'm biracial. I'm half black, half white. I'm bicultural. My mother's German. My father's American. And I was sort of always in between. And for me, the distinctions of between you're this or you're that never really made sense, because I was never this or that. In my sort of academic career, if you want to call it that, it was sort of weird to me that we would separate thinking about individuals from thinking about groups. But in fact, we do that. We have a group called psychology, and they're over on campus in one direction. We have a group called social psychology, and they're a different part of campus. And it's sort of weird because they don't go to the same parties. They don't like each other. They don't, even though they have the psychologists, they have the same word in their title. It's like, well, how can this be? And I think what you're saying is right, that we sort of become so overtrained, and we start to only listen to ourselves or people like us. We try to produce more students who are just like us and who think the way that we think. And pretty soon, the cost of success as a faculty member, for that matter, is that you have some kind of party line that you're towing, and that by towing that line is how you move up in the organization. And this is an organization like so many others. And I know that's true in many organizations where, what it used to mean to be an IBM man, you had to wear the blue suit and the white shirt and the garters and all that stuff. And if you didn't do that, if you weren't able to conform, then you were just ejected. You were selected out of the system. And so I think the world's getting a little bit more, I don't know if tolerant's the right word, but more tolerant for people who do sort of work in the interstitial areas. And at times we need that. Sometimes we need to dig deep, and sometimes we need to dig across. And so I feel like we're sort of in one of these digging across areas right now.
People talk about artificial intelligence, and in a world where artificial intelligence is going after expert roles, so it's easier for AI to go after a certain task or a certain role, but it's not so easy to go across different realms or different disciplines, and therefore multidisciplinary skills is actually a very valuable thing in these turbulent times.
Yes, that's right. I hadn't thought of it that way. That's really, I think it's really profound and important to think of expertise as the thing that's going to be sort of made. And in fact, that would be consistent with the history of the Industrial Revolution. The people used to run the milling machines, and they figured out what the movements were, and they recorded them, and then they put it into a CNC, computer numeric control machine. Put all those people out of work, just like that. And if that were to take that into the world of general expertise, where you're generally an expert, that's interesting implications.
Hence, teaching people to be more human and understand stuff like the next constraint, which is societal constraints, is really key.
Right. So my concept here with societal constraints are that I have a colleague friend who's an anthropologist, and he studies. They study down in Guatemala and Mexico, other places. One of the questions comes up of why did the Maya disappear? So the Maya, just this whole, it was like as if the Roman Empire all of a sudden just collapsed and was gone. And one of the arguments is that it was because, at least one of the more far out arguments is that it was because people were unwilling to give up their lifestyle choices in the world of climate change. So there's climate change, and people are unwilling to give that stuff up, and so they just basically end up with this problem. The crops fail, everything collapses, and all that. So I was kind of thinking, well, why would a society not want to innovate? Why would a society not want to find a new way to do things if the old way is sort of going away? And the sort of the answers I come up with are things like identity. So what does it mean to be one of us? Whatever us is us as an Irishman or American, a German or whatever. So there's this idea of our values and our identity. And then there's basically the social controls, what is the word I'm looking for. Basically, how do we control people? So when I'm driving down the street, there's certain assumptions I can make that you'll drive on the other side of the street, and you won't just all of a sudden swerve into my side of the street. And so that's called social control. And some of it's internalized, and some of it's in laws, some of it's in different places, different ways that they bring it up. And then the last one was sort of tradition and history. So these three things: my identity, how social control is exerted, and then also the traditions and history that are part of where I am and what I am sort of come into play as well. And so those three things are interesting, because if you think about who I am, what kind of person I am, and look at something like the Segway, as a you can argue there's all kinds of functional arguments you can make. Well, the battery didn't last long, or it allows you to do all these things, but in the end, do you want to be one of those people who rides that thing? As when people see you going across the parking lot, is that who you want to be? I think that's sort of an interesting one that really brings it home for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's like, how does society see me, or how would I like it to be seen? It's like the hipsters.
Yeah.
It's funny because when I think of the 6 constraints you've called out, it's like they get increasingly easier in one sense, in that when you start at the center of the individual, you're actually trying to change people, and it's like a difficulty matrix. It's it's really difficult. And then when you come out, the last one, 0.6, the 6th constraint, is technological constraints. In a way,
Right.
It's the easiest one, because you're changing technology and not people.
Yeah, and it's sort of been the default for a long time. I think the idea of just throw more money in there, throw more time in there. So the Manhattan Project, all kinds of things we're working on now, even like lithium-ion batteries. It's not that, that there aren't smart or creative individuals. It's not about the groups. It's not the organizations, on and on and on. But it really is about the technology. And for me, the main point with this one is with the sort of the technological constraints is that I sort of talk about like making matter behave. Like I have an atom here and I need it over there. I have a hemoglobin here and I need it there, because if I'm doing brain surgery, I got to keep this body alive. And so sometimes those problems are just a matter of money and time and R&D and science and basic science and those kinds of things. And so then to take the whole picture then is to say, well, the issue, to go back to an analogy I was using earlier, joke, was about the airport bookstore. So now let's say you have these 6 books, a book on the individual and how to make people more creative, a book on groups and how to make psychological safety really important, a book on organizations and how to structure your innovation efforts, a book on industry and how competition and disruption works, a book on society and what values, social values, what are the social trends now, how are kids and millennials thinking about this and that, or a book on technological development, so let's say coding and C++, C#, whatever. If you're in the bookstore and you happen to grab one of those books off the shelf, it will tell you that's the problem, that's the problem of innovation. When in fact, it may be that you have a different problem. That maybe your problem is how you run groups and it's not the technological part. Or maybe your problem is the technological part and your way you run groups is fine. If you don't see them all in a framework that allows you to sort of compare and contrast them, to say which one of these creates the most explanatory power for the problem I'm trying to solve, if you can't see them next to each other, then I think you're sort of stuck with whatever you happen to grab off the shelf. If you're lucky, you grab the right book, but it's a 1 in 5 chance that you'll grab the right book off the shelf. So my goal was really to try to put these different perspectives next to each other. And the thing, sort of the dirty secret, I think, of academia is that we keep these really strong barriers, these really strong silos between like psychology and economics and social psychology and anthropology and the engineering and science disciplines. And what happens is if you write a book like I did that talks about across the different disciplines, I get no love from any of them, because the people who I'm more like, I'm actually been trained more as a social psychologist than anything else. I'm much more like them, but then the psychologists say, well, you're not one of us. You can't talk about us. And the economists say, yeah, you're not one of us. You can't talk about us. And then I go back to my social psychologist and says, well, don't you still love me? And they're like, no, as long as you're talking to those guys and those other guys, we don't like you anymore. So you end up in this funny place where you're trying to get at a bigger truth. And so what I decided to do with my book, and really my book is meant for managers. It doesn't throw off any great academic kudos to me, but it does help people who are in the problem where they have to manage and they're trying to figure out, like, what do I do here? Do I hire more smart people? Do I restructure this part of the organization? Do I just sit tight and throw more money in there? And I think those are the kind of questions that I'm interested in, and that I've taken the sort of the real, almost sort of dilettantish views into these different academic disciplines to put this book together. So here's what you need to know about those psychologists. And if you want to know more, go read there, but understand this is their world. They think about what happens between your ears, like what's happening in your brain, which is really different than what happens when your competitor comes out of nowhere, like Uber did, or like Airbnb. Like, it's really just a different thing. And you need to know which of those 2 books you want to look at, or which one of those academic viewpoints you want to observe from. So that's what I want to say. And then I've gotten lots of great feedback from managers. I've gotten 0 great feedback from academics. So I'll just leave it at that.
It's funny when you were saying that, and I could picture you, and I could empathize in a way where, you're trying to get other parts of the organization to come together. You have to kind of wear a mask in certain roles, and you have to, you're like very much an actor in that you have to, and that doesn't feel good because you can't be yourself, because you have to bring everybody with you. And I suppose it's like, while you're saying you got lots of great feedback from managers, you really need to be both a leader and a manager to make this happen, or else you need huge leadership support from the very, very top to make this happen.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right.
Well, David, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And where can people find out more? Because I know you write and you have a blog, etc.
Yeah. At this point, my website, creativepeoplemustbestopped.com, is the best way. I'm currently revamping that, and that's going to go in different directions. And I'm not super active in on the online Twitter and things like that, but most of the stuff I do, I send out through. There's a mailing list on creativepeoplemustbestopped.com that you can go there. There's also a survey. You can do a survey if you want to see if any of these innovation constraints are big in your life. Take the little survey. It'll email you some responses back.
David Owens, Professor of Business Strategy and Innovation with Vanderbilt University and author of Creative People Must Be Stopped, 6 Ways We Kill Innovation Without Even Trying. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.